Today on the Everything 80s podcast, the story of MTV.
Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. And what you heard there was the very first intro on the first broadcast of MTV. That's how they kicked off the whole station. It goes a little longer to include the entire beginning where there is a space shuttle countdown launch into the whole thing. And that's one of the reasons why MTV's always had that connection with the Spaceman or the Moonman Award from the MTV Awards. And this whole episode is going to look back on the amazing story of how MTV got up and running, how it probably should have failed at first, but how it ended up really changing pop culture and the way we consume music. So we'll get right to that. First things first, though, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, make sure you do that wherever you find your podcast, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher Radio, whatever. I should be there. Okay, let's do this. If you grew up in the 80s, you're very familiar with MTV, but you might not know the whole story and how it gave birth to what we now know as the first music videos. It didn't originate them primarily, but it did sort of perfect them and launch them. If you're a kid growing up today, you probably don't know what a music video is. Well, you do, but you don't know them in the format they first existed. You've probably just seen them on YouTube or whatever, and you've probably never seen one on TV because they don't exist anymore. But there was a time when music videos ruled the TV landscape. So MTV, just in case you're unfamiliar, is a music television station. It was launched August 1st, 1981. It would play music videos, which were a relatively new concept, and they were presented by video jockeys or VJs. So when MTV first came out in 81, I was way too young. I was around 4 years old. So, I wouldn't even been aware of it at the time, but it would pick up its steam right into my own probably musical interest and wheelhouse going into the mid and late 80s when everyone was, more aware of it and MTV was more prominent. Again, I lived in Canada, so we had MTV, but we also had our version up here called Much Music. They were both playing, though, the same videos, groundbreaking shows like Yo MTV Raps, and the history of this station and this channel is pretty unique, and just, again, like I said, the way it would change pop culture and the way we consume music. So the whole story actually goes back to New Zealand, and they are probably the ones responsible for MTV as we know it. So it was created by Viacom Media Networks, but it goes back to 1977 with the possibility of the creation of specialty channels. Warner Cable, which was a division of Warner Communications, had launched the first two-way interactive cable television system in Columbus, Ohio. It was called Cube, with a Q, Q-U-B-E, and it was able to offer several specialty channels. One specialty channel they had was called Sight on Sound. It was a music channel, but would show clips from certain concerts and shows that were music-oriented. They weren't really music videos to speak of back then, so it was more of a channel to showcase music in different various formats. Since Cube was interactive, viewers were able to engage by voting on things like their favorite artists, songs, favorite albums. These were very archaic times, and voting would have to be done by an ancient technology such as mail and telephones. So if you're a kid, you're going to have to ask your parents what those things are. But this would be important in the history of MTV. The concept seemed intriguing and had the potential to be taken in more advanced direction. Robert W. Pittman would be the guy who would be at the forefront of creating MTV. He had this idea in the back of his head when he used to host a 15-minute show called Album Tracks in New York on WNB-TV. This was in the late 70s, and with this idea and the new interactive format being used by Warner Cable, this would help set the stage for MTV. Pittman had a boss that was instrumental in the history of MTV who was named John Lack. Lack had tried out a show called Pop Clips that was the creation of former Monkey Mike Nesmith, the Hey Hey We're the Monkeys. Nesmith was inspired by seeing this format work in New Zealand from a show called Radio and Pictures. Radio and Pictures had come out in 1976 and was a concept that had been around since the mid-60s. As pop culture had really started to explode in the 60s, music, and primarily American music and, music from the UK, was starting to spread all over the world. Music videos did not exist yet, and to see a band on TV meant having to watch a live performance. So since New Zealand was so far away, and Australia, that part of the world, it made promoting yourself and your music pretty difficult. A solution arose when the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation started working with the record labels. They figured out it would be best for the labels to supply promotional music clips that they could play on air for no charge. Their artists would now get this extra exposure in a remote and English-speaking part of the world without having to make super long trips to get there. The concept was all put together, and the format would involve playing these video clips or music videos of current songs, but they were very bare bones. It was pretty much just seeing the artist play. It's not that music videos didn't exist, but they definitely were not commonplace. The idea was to combine the airplay of the few available music videos, but keep them playing 24 hours a day. So MTV launched 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 1st, 1981, and they debuted with that phrase I just played at the start, "Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll." This was spoken by John Lack and was played over that footage of the Space Shuttle countdown, and specifically the Space Shuttle Columbia. This kicked into the original MTV theme song that you heard, and it had an image of an American flag on the moon that changed to the MTV logo. And you've probably seen this a million times. It's a pretty iconic image. Made great use of the Memphis style, which was a new style that was arising in the 80s, which would give the real aesthetic and design, with a lot of squiggly lines and fluorescent colors. And I did a whole podcast on the very interesting story of the Memphis design and the Memphis group, so check that episode out. So the question is, what was the very first video played on MTV? And if you're a music buff, you know this as your standard trivia. It was "Video Killed the Radio Star" by the Buggles. Then "I Want My MTV" was introduced in 1982, and that would be the famous catchphrase that would often be repeated through pop culture. This apparently goes back to a old commercial in the either 50s or 60s that Mickey Mantle, the baseball player, was in, and I think it was for an Oats product, and he's basically just saying, "I want my," whatever the name of the product was, and they kind of rehash that and use that into their kind of statement and their catchphrase for the entire network. So the thing I didn't know about this is that MTV only first debuted in New Jersey, so only Garden State people got to see the first music videos ever played on American TV. So they got to see "Video Killed the Radio Star." But what was the second video to ever play in the history of MTV? It was "You Better Run" by Pat Benatar. So that's some good dinner party trivia right there. And it's considered actually the first rock performance, because "Video Killed the Radio Star" was a little more electronic based or whatnot. So looking at the early days at MTV, the concept of playing videos 24/7 was a new one. And unfortunately, the technology was not quite there yet. So if you were watching in these early days, you would often see periods of just complete black on the screen, as an employee would have to physically switch tapes into a new machine called a VCR. And I've covered the history of the VCR and the VHS beta wars in one of the first couple episodes, so check that one out too. That's another amazing story of the history of the original format wars. There were also a lot of repeats, because in those early days, there were only a few hundred music videos that they had in their system. They would also have to put in stock NASA footage at 20 past the hour for what was called local avail. This local avail was a time period where local cable companies could sell advertising. The problem was no one wanted to buy advertising, so they were stuck having to fill this empty time slot. So a lot of people would think these just random stock NASA footage were actual videos. The thing was, even though MTV was only playing in certain markets, it wasn't attracting a lot of advertisers and interest, but at the same time, in those certain markets, it was a success immediately. So local record stores that were in locations where MTV was playing were starting to sell more records for songs that weren't being played on the radio. Some of these early unknown bands at the time included Men at Work, The Human League. Another big one was Bow Wow Wow, which I'd never heard of, but apparently they were able to ride that early wave of MTV success. This was all happening within 2 months of the launch of MTV, and they were already starting to notice something very unexpected. The original target audience for MTV was going to be between 12 to 34 years of age. After doing some research, they found that over 50% of the audience was actually between 12 and 24 years old. They also found that this age range watched more MTV for an average of at least 30 minutes to 2 hours. They were expecting this to be a little more of an older crowd. It was something that would eventually lead to VH1. They thought they were going to have a bit of a more mature audience, but it was the younger, kind of just to be becoming teenagers and young adults that were the most interested. So MTV then would see a massive growth due to the little small island in the North Sea that had once conquered America once before. And this leads us to the second British invasion. Everyone knows about the first British invasion, which obviously includes, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Dave Clark Five, Herman's Hermits, the Hollies, the Animals, Led Zeppelin. But this second British invasion would happen in this new age of video, and it was primarily because of one TV show, Top of the Pops. In case you don't know Top of the Pops, this is a British staple, an institution in England that was shown on the BBC and started in 1964 and ran all the way until 2006. It was a British music chart TV show where popular acts would come on to perform if they were that week's best-selling artists. This show is, again, a massive kind of backbone of British pop culture, and it was always important leading up to the coveted Christmas #1 spot, and that was the most valuable chart position of the year. The acts would usually lip sync their songs, and then sometimes they would play the backing tracks to try to recreate the exact song from the record when they perform on Top of the Pops. Bands in England were used to having to get on TV and doing somewhat of a live music video. There would also be pre-recorded clips, and the main thing was the British bands knew how important appearance was and presenting your music and aesthetic in a short time frame. In North America, bands just had to worry about creating a great song, a great album, and a really good concert experience. They weren't really having to appear on TV. There's the odd late night performance and whatever, but there was no concept of having to make a music video. In England, if you're going to be successful, you would have to appear on Top of the Pops and get used to being recorded by cameras. So kids in Britain who grew up watching Top of the Pops and who would become musicians were used to this music video format from watching it through the 60s and 70s. So by the time it came for them to get in front of the camera, they were totally ready. They had already appeared on TV multiple times, and they knew the importance of production values and appearance. So when MTV launches, bands like Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, The Kinks, The Culture Club were completely ready and embraced this new music television. Some of them had already been making their own music videos too, so they knew how to make these short films and also look good in them. Some big American rock bands were really having trouble with this new format, and they didn't know how to present themselves. And if you add to that a lot of these, if you look back on these kind of classic bands, in the 70s going into the 80s, were not exactly very easy on the eyes. And as much as, English bands were kind of looked down upon for being maybe too pretty or glam, whatever, they knew they had to look good on TV. Duran Duran is probably the best example of that. And at the time, and they were able to create quite a frenzy in the States as girls had been able to watch them for a while now on MTV, and they were liking what they saw. They were the pretty dreamy band from England. So let's look at the original VJs. Everyone knew what a DJ was, but what was a VJ? MTV wanted to go with more album-oriented rock at first, featuring more well-known and established bands. The problem was they found out their audience was younger than they had anticipated, and they had to move into more top 40 bass music. Another problem was a lot of the music in the top 40 was by unknown new singers and bands. There was also new styles of music people really didn't understand, including new wave and more electronic dance-based music. So this leads them to having to use younger presenters to introduce these new videos and artists, and that's where the term video jockey or VJ was coined. So those original first 5 VJs were Mark Goodman, Nina Blackwood, Alan Hunter, JJ Jackson, and Martha Quinn, not the medicine woman. The VJs would start to become celebrities in their own right, and sometimes MTV would use guest VJs such as Adam Ant, Billy Idol, Phil Collins, Simon Le Bon would be on there every now and then. And arguably one of the most famous VJs of all would be Downtown Julie Brown. She was the host of the Club MTV show from 1987 until 1982. Her full name was Julie Dorn Brown, and she had been a dancer on Top of the Pops. The show she hosted on MTV was one of the very first that exclusively played dance music. So with these different styles coming, everything's starting off fresh and new and exciting, but some issues came up very early on. And it's one of the tougher subjects, but it's been covered a lot, and that's surrounding the issue of black music. So despite the massive amount of amazing black musicians in the early 80s, MTV wasn't really playing them. There was the thought that the average white viewer wouldn't be able to embrace it. There was one group of color that had been shown on the original few days, and that was a British band called the Specials, who were made up of black and white members. The reason why MTV wasn't playing them was they said they were a rock-based music station. But as they moved into top 40, this was impossible to keep leaning on. It was alleged that they were straight up rejecting videos like Super Freak by Rick James because it didn't, quote, fit their format, unquote. Either way, it was getting a bit messy. And then Michael Jackson moonwalked. Michael Jackson obviously was a big star in 1983, but Thriller had just come out and he wasn't the king of pop yet. He wasn't the absolute phenomenon he would become. And anything obviously to do with Michael Jackson is so hard to touch upon, but when you're looking back at the 80s, it has to be acknowledged what the guy did for music and pop culture. So a program was aired on May 16th, 1983 that was called Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, and Forever, which was a televised special that was the celebration of the creation of the famous Motown label. The show wanted artists to perform older hits, and that included Michael Jackson, who they wanted to perform some Jackson 5 material. Jackson had a brand new song called Billie Jean that he was adamant on performing, but they weren't letting older artists like Marvin Gaye do any of his new songs. Jackson was able to convince them and perform Billie Jean, and though it only lasted 2.5 seconds, his performance featured a new dance move called the Moonwalk that would blow people away. Most everyone saw this show, and this performance helped to excel Michael Jackson's popularity seemingly overnight. After that performance, Thriller started selling 1 million copies a week and would become the #1 album for 1983 and 1984. Think how big an album is to be #1 a year later. That's how much this album was selling. You can still, in case you've never seen his performance, you can watch his first time moonwalking on, different YouTube videos. The thing is, he did not invent the moonwalk. It had been used for decades, but he obviously made it more prominent. If you're watching the video, I think it's around the 4-minute and 12-second mark. So again, talking about Michael Jackson is tough in this modern time, but it's almost redundant to say how mind-blowing this guy was as a performer. But MTV still weren't playing him. So Walter Yanetkoff had finally had enough. He was the head of CBS Records and said the color barrier had to be broken. He cursed out MTV and said he was holding back any black music from CBS so that it could not be played on MTV unless they started to play Billie Jean. Billie Jean was added in, but not right away. A normal rotation would involve a video being played at least 2 to 3 times, and that didn't include Billie Jean until it hit #1 on Billboard. It then went into this medium rotation, but then by March of 1983, it went into heavy rotation. And then this was just 1 week before Beat It was to come out. They then started to regularly play artists like Prince, Eddie Grant, Donna Summer, Herbie Hancock, Lionel Richie, And then when the video for Thriller came out, it completely changed the way music videos were approached and made. What used to be based on performances could now tell stories. The Thriller video would open up more pop and R&B music playing on MTV, along with a brand new art form, and this is the introduction of hip-hop. If hip-hop had come out earlier in the 80s, I don't think it would have survived as a music genre. If MTV wasn't playing Michael Jackson, there was no way in hell they were going to play rap videos. Hip-hop was picking up steam in the early 80s, but thanks to Michael Jackson, it opened up the doors for this new form of music to be embraced and shared. Artists that would be big hits on MTV would include Run DMC, LL Cool J, the Fat Boys, the Beastie Boys, and then there would be the giant crossover that would make a mark on the culture and music videos. The band Aerosmith had been big through the 70s, but were kind of fading going into the 80s. They weren't really, embracing or being embraced by the MTV era. They had released a song called Walk This Way in 1975 that was pretty much sitting around collecting dust. Run DMC was working on their album Raising Hell that was being produced by an upstart young producer named Rick Rubin. He pulled out an album called Toys in the Attic that featured Walk This Way that they would use to freestyle over. Run DMC had only heard the first few seconds of the song and had no idea who Aerosmith was, but Rubin presented the idea of remaking the song. They all weren't into it except for Jam Master Jay, but eventually came around and recorded it with Joe Perry and Steven Tyler. The song caught on and was being played on both rock and urban stations. When it came time to make a video for it, they created a musical duel between two different studios that ends with Tyler knocking down the wall into a joint performance. Walk This Way became the first hip-hop video to be played in heavy rotation in the history of MTV and relaunched the career of Aerosmith. Here's some fun facts on that video. It was made for only $67,000, and none of the band performing are the other members of Aerosmith besides Perry and Tyler. Steven Tyler was also hesitant to make the video as he didn't want them to look stupid or appear to be being made fun of. And we can't mention, main rising stars of the MTV era without mentioning Madonna. If there was a breakout star for the MTV era, it would have to be Madonna Louise Ciccone, who would be considered the queen of pop. Michael Jackson could be considered a breakout star when it came to MTV, but he had already been famous for years. Madonna capitalized on the new artistic expression that could be used in music videos, and the music could also be tied into fashion and art. She had a few big hits in the early 80s with songs like Burning Up, but they were more club-based songs. She then released Holiday, which was the third single off her album and her first international top 10 hit. She had a unique style that included a lot of lace tops, shirts over capri pants, fishnet stockings, jewelry, bracelets, bleached hair, kind of a punk look. And this would influence the style for a lot of girls all over North America and the world. You could call her the first Kardashian. Her next studio album, Like a Virgin, would push Madonna to the next level. The title track, Like a Virgin, would embrace and launch her popularity while also introducing controversy. The video for Like a Virgin agitated a lot of conservative organizations, but again increased her popularity. Madonna would be the first woman to sell over 5 million copies of an album, and the album would end up certified diamond and would sell over 21 million copies. MTV was instrumental in sharing her music and image, but she would push things even further with a little performance at the still new MTV Video Music Awards. Madonna would perform Like a Virgin, which started out with her on top of a wedding cake and would end up with her rolling around the stage for the majority of the song. It's considered one of the most iconic performances in the history of MTV and also by critics. The performance skyrocketed her popularity and increased her fame overnight. Again, these were the days when entire careers could be made in one show or performance. With only a couple networks and very few things to watch on TV, there was a good chance a large majority of the country was tuning in, and one big moment could launch careers of singers, bands, comedians, and performers. Madonna, of course, would release other monster hits and accompanying videos, including Material Girl, Crazy for You, Into the Groove, Papa Don't Preach, True Blue, Open Up Your Heart, Who's That Girl? Obviously instrumental in the success of herself and MTV at the same time. So we'll look at the future of MTV, and there's so much to cover with the history of MTV over the years that this could be an entire podcast on its own. I was mainly wanting to cover the period from its conception and launch into the 80s. And over the years, there would still be many monumental videos and moments that would become significant parts of pop culture. Heading into the mid-90s, the play of music videos started to drop big time. Between 1995 to 2000, music videos were played 36.5% less. Music videos went from being played at least 8 hours a day down to 3. The advent of reality shows and reality television switched the focus on MTV with shows like Singled Out, The Osbournes, Punk'd, Pimp My Ride, that piece of crap show with Jessica Simpson and Nick Lachey, and then up to the juggernauts of things like Jersey Shore. MTV would eventually stop playing music videos, as with the advancement of YouTube and online sources, there really was no point. Everything can now be accessed instantly, and no one is going to wait around to watch something on TV, not knowing when it may or may not be played. So we'll wrap it up here. The history of MTV shows how it is a cultural institution and acts like a backbone of pop culture in the 80s. It's when artists were really able to express and present themselves beyond just the music. Music videos created a new way that artists could connect with their fans and evolved into a brand new art form. A lot of times a good video could make up for a crappy song, and a great song could become epic with the right music videos. The 80s was this great explosion of pop culture, and MTV was absolutely at the forefront of this whole new revolution. So we'll finish it there. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode and, have your own fond memories of MTV and your favorite music videos over the years and everything like that. So thanks again for listening. Again, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcast. If you really like the podcast, leave it a rating and review. More people get to see it that way. But I appreciate you taking the time to check this show out, and I'll see you soon. Bye.